Welcome everybody to RUSI. It's a great pleasure to see you all here and to see quite a number of familiar faces, but also many new ones. This is I understand, the 17th RUSI Missile Defense Conference. That's quite a number, isn't it? And I remember quite a number of them myself over the years. And a recurring theme in many of the conferences in the past, or a tremor in the conferences, was, well, is missile defense a passé topic? It is a marginal topic over a period of 17 years when so much of the focus of our work as security and defense analysts has been on interventions in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and indeed for those with long memories of Balkans, places where missile defense really wasn't all that relevant. Over that period, there was some sense that this was quite a marginal community. Well, it doesn't feel like that today. It feels today we're in a world in which ballistic missiles are more important. They're important conventionally as much, if not more, than when armed with WMD. And they're important in a number of different theaters around the world. And we're going to be covering those different theaters around the world in the conference today and tomorrow. But perhaps the most dramatic change in perceptions, and I think also in reality over the last couple of years, has been in relation to Russia. So it's entirely appropriate that we have this first session with quite a NATO focus, a focus on the run-up to the Warsaw Summit and what the emerging debate around the role of BMD is in relation to both national preparations by NATO member states and also NATO's view itself. As Mike explained, but I'd just like to reiterate, all the speeches from the platform are on the record and indeed are being filmed as we speak and are attributable to the individual concerned, but then thereafter the cameras will be switched off and all Q&A is entirely off the record. So if you want to get something that interested you from the discussion, you do have to approach the individual concerned to see whether they're prepared to go on the record in those particular events. And we'll have 3 speakers and then plenty of time for Q&A until we finish this session at 10:30. The first speaker will be Frank Rose, who I'm sure is known to many of you for his long interest in this issue, in his latest incarnation as Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Verification and Compliance in the US State Department. And then he will be followed by Bob Bell to provide some balance between state and defense. We've then got Bob Bell coming in, and he's a senior civilian representative of the US Secretary of Defense in Europe and the senior defense advisor to the UN's ambassador to NATO. And we'll complete the lineup with Roberta Zadra, who again followed these issues very closely, key point person in NATO through the period of NATO-Russia dialogue on these issues and heads NATO's integrated air and missile defense section today after that period of dialogue regrettably came to an end. So without further ado, Frank, would you like to get us started?
Well, Malcolm, thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be back here at RUSI. I remember coming down to RUSI when I was a student at King's College 17 years ago, so I have aged a bit, gained a little more weight, but it is always a pleasure to be back here. I'd like to use my brief time on the podium to focus on 3 issues. First, I'd like to provide you an update on where we are in implementing the President's European phase adaptive approach to missile defense. Second, I'll say a few words about missile defense in Russia. And third, I'll briefly summarize some of the other missile defense activities the United States government has ongoing with partners and allies in other theaters of the world. I'll leave the specifics of the NATO missile defense decision at the Warsaw Summit to Bob and Roberto, who have been living this issue every day. I only come in and out as required. When I first attended this RUSI conference in 2010 as the representative from the State Department, and when I think back to the early days of the Obama administration, it's striking how much has been accomplished on missile defense. It was September 2009 when President Obama announced his plan for strengthening missile defense in Europe, which became known as the European Phase Adaptive Approach, or EPAA. And as with the unveil of anything new, there were lots of questions about what the plan was and what it would do. That said, we have made tremendous progress in implementing the EPAA over the past 7 years. Starting in 2011 with Phase 1, we deployed a missile defense radar in Turkey and began the sustained deployment of Aegis ballistic missile defense capable ships in the Mediterranean. I had the pleasure of being the lead negotiator for the missile defense radar in Turkey. Additionally, we have been working with Spain, and just last September, forward deployed the fourth and final U.S. Aegis BMD-capable ship at the naval facility in Rota, which will allow us to increase our rotational presence in the region and respond to potential crises more rapidly. As part of Phase 2 of the EPAA, we completed deployment of the Aegis Ashore site in Romania in December of last year, and Bob had the opportunity to go and represent the Department of Defense at the ceremony. I give tremendous credit to my Missile Defense Agency and Romanian colleagues for making this happen. They were able to take a site from concept to operationally deployed in 6 years while staying on time and on budget, and that is a big deal. Combined with BMD-capable ships in the Mediterranean, the site in Romania will provide significant enhancements to coverage of NATO's from short and medium-range ballistic missile threats emanating from outside the Euro-Atlantic area. Finally, Phase 3 will involve the construction of an Aegis Ashore site in Poland equipped with the new SM-3 Block 2A interceptor, which will give the NATO system the capability to engage intermediate-range ballistic missiles. In February of this year, the Missile Defense Agency awarded the construction contract for this site. President Obama's FY17 budget request designates approximately $127 million for the acquisition of Aegis Ashore system in fiscal year 2017. Construction will begin this spring, enabling us to remain on schedule to complete this site in the 2018 timeframe. The Phase 3 site in Poland, when combined with our other EPAA assets, will provide ballistic missile defense coverage of all NATO European territory, population, and forces from threats originating outside the Euro-Atlantic area. Based on the success we've had implementing the EPAA and developing the NATO Missile Defense Command and Control System, which Bob and Roberta will discuss in their presentations, the U.S. believes that we should be in a position to declare initial operating capability of the NATO Missile Defense System at the Warsaw Summit this July. Let me now say a few things about missile defense and Russia. As you're well aware, Russia continues to raise significant concerns about U.S. and NATO missile defenses. In particular, Russia is concerned that U.S. and NATO missile defenses are designed to negate Russia's strategic nuclear deterrent. Both the United States and NATO have made clear that U.S. missile defenses in the system NATO is building in Europe is not designed for or capable of undermining Russia's strategic deterrent capabilities. The U.S. and NATO have explained this to Russia on many occasions over the past several years. For example, At the 2014 Wales Summit, NATO heads of state and government stated, and I quote, "As we did in Chicago in 2012, we reaffirm that NATO missile defense is not directed against Russia and will not undermine Russia's strategic deterrence capabilities," end quote. It is also regrettable that Russia did not respond positively to the many offers to cooperate on missile defense over the years. I think it is important for us to remind people that it was Russia that terminated unilaterally a cooperative dialogue with NATO on missile defense in 2013. Russia has also continued to demand that the U.S. and NATO provide it with, quote, legally binding guarantees that our missile defenses will not undermine its strategic nuclear deterrent. In response, we have made it clear that we cannot and will not accept legally binding or other constraints that would hinder our ability to defend the United States, our allies, and our partners. The guarantees that Russia has demanded were based on a criteria that would significantly limit our missile defenses and undermine our ability to stay ahead of the ballistic missile threat. North Korea and Iran's repeated ballistic missile launches and the overall evolving threat from these countries dictates that we must be able to keep up with their evolving technology. The fact that these programs continue to advance in spite of United Nations Security Council resolutions and international pressure are a convincing reminder of why the United States will continue to insist on having the flexibility to respond effectively to this threat. Finally, let me say a few things about missile defense cooperation in the Middle East and the Asia-Pacific regions. In the Middle East, we are already cooperating bilaterally and multilaterally with our key partners through the U.S. Gulf Cooperation Council on ballistic missile defense, through a working group we set up after the 2015 U.S. GCC summit at Camp David to show U.S. commitment to Gulf security. Our partners in the region are acquiring tremendous interoperable BMD capabilities that complement and supplement U.S. missile defense systems. Additionally, and separately, the United States maintains a strong defense relationship with Israel, and our cooperation on missile defense has resulted in a comprehensive missile defense architecture for Israel. In the Asia-Pacific, we are continuing missile defense cooperation through our bilateral alliances and key partnerships. The United States and Japan are working closely together to develop the SM-3 Block 2A interceptor, which will make a key contribution to the European phase adaptive approach, as well as ship-based deployments in the Asia-Pacific region and elsewhere around the world. Indeed, on December 8th of last year, we successfully completed a flight test of this new interceptor. We also deployed in 2014 a second missile defense radar to Japan, which will enhance both the defense of the United States and Japan. The United States is also working closely with the Republic of Korea on missile defense issues. In response to the evolving threat from North Korea, including its nuclear weapon and ballistic missile programs, we made an alliance decision in February to begin formal consultations on the viability of basing the THAAD system in the ROK. This system would provide an essential defensive capability against North Korea's extended-range Scuds and no-dong ballistic missiles. The goal of the formal consultations is to bilaterally pursue the feasibility of deploying a THAAD to and operating on the Korean Peninsula at the earliest possible date. Now, China has expressed concern that the potential deployment of THAAD to the ROK represents a threat to its strategic deterrent. However, as the 2010 Ballistic Missile Defense Review states, U.S. homeland missile defenses are not designed to negate China's strategic nuclear deterrent. And contrary to China's claims, neither the THAAD interceptor nor the THAAD radar will do that either. If THAAD is deployed to the ROK and no final decision has been made. It would be focused solely on North Korea and contribute to a layered missile defense that would enhance the U.S. ROK alliance's existing missile defense capabilities against North Korea missile threats. Let me conclude with 3 brief points. First, given the significant progress that we have made on implementing the European phased adaptive approach and the excellent work that NATO has done on command and control, we believe that the alliance is in a position at the Warsaw Summit to declare IOC of the NATO missile defense system. Second, let me reemphasize this point. The U.S. and NATO missile defense systems are not designed for or capable of undermining Russia's strategic deterrent. Third, in addition to the work we are doing with our NATO allies on missile defense in Europe, we're also continuing our robust cooperation with our allies and partners in the Middle East and the Asia-Pacific regions. So let me stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, Frank, thank you so much for that very clear, concise, and actually quite short summary of where we are, and I think it set us up very well for the rest of this panel. Bob, over to you.
Well, thank you, Malcolm. And like Frank, I just want to begin by saying it's always a pleasure to be back with RUSI. Like Frank, I think I go back 17 years to that first conference here. Unlike Frank, I wish I could say I came to that first conference as a student at King's College, but I think I was a few years ahead of Frank in academia, so I came as ASG at NATO, as I recall. The title of this undertaking we're on here today at RUSI is Strategic Goals and Aspirations for Warsaw. And I don't know who wrote that, maybe it was you, Malcolm, or Karen, but it's a very apt title because this is really what summitry is all about. Nations define strategic goals, and you start a countdown about 2 years out to achieve them. Some are more aspirational than others. For example, one of our aspirational goals for Warsaw is formal NATO-EU cooperation. This one is more achievable. But it still has to be earned. It's like that last scene in Saving Private Ryan, you know. It has to be earned. And we're working hard at this. We can't just declare it by fiat. We have 3 months to go with some homework to do. But I'm here to pick up where Frank left off, basically, and make the case that the U.S. government feels quite strongly that not only is this achievable by Warsaw, but we're confident that we will. So what I want to do in that regard is review progress on NATO BMD since the interim, if I can have my second slide, and my only slide, so I'm not going to have death by PowerPoint here. I'm just going to talk to one chart. If you want to just speed read that and go get more coffee, I'll understand. But let me elaborate on this chart. Let's start with the title, Progress Since Inca. That's not the people that used to live in Mexico. Of course, INCA stands for Interim Capability, which was declared at the Chicago Summit. And I make this point because sometimes I have a sense that in the NATO debates, not with Roberto, of course, but with others, that they think this would be a first declaration of an operational capability. But the interim capability, which was declared 4 years ago at Chicago, in paragraph 60 and 61 of that communique, just to remind what the baseline here is, trying to move from INCA to IOC, which of course is not FOC, but a midpoint. Our heads of state and government said 4 years ago that the alliance had achieved an interim NATO BMD capability, providing with immediate effect an operationally significant first step consistent with the Lisbon decision, offering maximum coverage within available means, defending populations, territory, and forces across southern NATO Europe. Okay? So that's the baseline we're starting from. For 4 years, we've been on the hook, if you will, at NATO. Had there been a crisis, let's say with Iran, if the joint agreement on the nuclear deal had gone very differently, and U.S. Aegis ships had been put under NATO C2 in a crisis, we would have been expected to be ready on day one for warfighting. So this is not starting afresh. To that end, going back 4 years ago, we had a tremendous work program, which I'm sure Roberto remembers well, to make sure we could declare that we had political control of this mission. That was 4 years ago. And I'm pleased to say that 4 years ago, heads of state and government, in addition to emphasizing that full political control was and will be ensured, stated that the council at head of state level agreed 4 years ago that the prearranged command and control rules and procedures had been put in place necessary for INCA. And to do that, we had to push about 12 to 15 different NAC level policy documents through the whole process at the headquarters and get consensus agreement at 28. So we're starting from a firm foundation in trying to move to IOC. Then how do you measure what IOC is? Is it like beauty in the eye of the beholder? Pornography? You know it when you see it? I mean, admittedly, it's a bit subjective. Some of the programmatic milestones that we thought 4 years ago have slipped in terms of some original expectations. But in our view, there's full justification if we meet the remaining criteria to say that we've achieved a milestone that is significant and is worthy of being demarcated by applying to it the heading IOC. And I think you measure that in 3 ways, as shown on this chart: deployed capability, ensuring full political control, and increased functionality, both real-time and non-real-time planning. And let's just go through that very quickly. Now, in terms of deployed capability, I hate to use this term, but this is a slam dunk, okay? This is a no-brainer. By our calculations, since the Chicago summit 4 years ago, we have increased the capability of NATO's missile defense asset base, the architecture, by an order of magnitude. In other words, tenfold. Now that's back of an envelope calculation, but we've gone from one ship that was home ported on the East Coast and had to transit the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, and those of you with military background know that that doesn't facilitate sustaining a patrol point if you need to go on station, to 4 ships that are forward deployed at Rota with very short turnaround cruises to their assigned defensive locations. Now, of course, 4 ships aren't always in service the same day, but there is a surge capacity here that dwarfs the capability that we had back at Chicago based on 1 ship that was on a cruise to the Med. Now, beyond that, of course, we're adding, as Frank emphasized, the Aegis Ashore facility in Romania, which is on station 24/7. By definition, this is not a multi-mission asset that's going to do port calls. These guys and these gals in the U.S. Navy manning this site are available 24/7. And this is a sea change in terms of a NATO capability, because the United States of America has decided to put this asset under permanent NATO C2, under a permanent transfer of authority 24/7. So that's a game changer from a crisis-based posture to a defense in being day in and day out. In itself, you could almost argue that would justify, based on the capability criteria, declaration of IOC. Beyond that, we've gone to a more capable missile, from the 1A to the 1B. Beyond that, we've gone to a more capable fire control system. So you add all of that up, the number of interceptors, the range of the interceptors, the quality, the simultaneous intercept capability, the availability on station, we think it's about 10 times the firepower we had at Chicago. And beyond that, in an operationally deployable sense, we've shown that it works. It's not academic, it's not hypothetical, it's not a planning document. In the at-sea demonstration 2015, which I had the pleasure of being at on the Mount Whitney, not too far north of here off the Hebrides, we had a multi-nation NATO flotilla that demonstrated full Link 16 interoperability as between the shooter ships, if you will, and the shotgun air defense ships. Beyond that, the Dutch ship that was deployed closest to the threat, it demonstrated that its track quality, where it picked up on its upgraded sensor, itself would have been sufficient to launch based on that detection. And then in the actual launch, of course, we shot down a ballistic missile, the first ever intercept of anything other than a short-range ballistic missile in the European theater of operations. So from the capability side, that's a pretty strong picture. But it's for nothing, if you will, in NATO terms, unless you can demonstrate full political control, because heads of state have to be assured that this is their system, not just a US system. Now, I won't catalog, of course, in that deployed capability column, all the additional assets in terms of TMD systems and sensors and radars that European allies have added to the architecture. I don't want to depreciate that in any way because it's been an important contribution. I'm just focusing right now on sort of the upper tier wide area population defense mission. So in terms of additional political control, first and foremost, the necessity to go beyond an interim BMD standing defense plan and basically an air policing, air defense standing defense plan, and combine those, merge those into a new integrated air and missile defense standing defense plan. And that work, which has been underway intensively for almost a year now, is literally at the moment of truth as we are here today, under a silence procedure out of the military committee that expires at 2 o'clock today. And we're hopeful that we will have this document in front of the NAC tomorrow when General Breedlove in his farewell appearance at NATO as SACEUR and General Gorick go through the whole mission with perm reps to assure them that we're on track here. Beyond that, there's been 4 or 5 other really important political control, if you will, building blocks put in place. Last October, we approved the new BMD Integrated Air and Missile Defense CONOPS, with the exception of a couple of tricky issues that took us until December. One of those issues that took us to December was the CONOPS for Aegis Ashore, which is a 24/7, 7-day-a-week NATO defense asset. That was hard to get agreement on, but we got it done by Christmas. We also agreed at the defense ministerial level last October on the political guidance for 2015, which basically is a very high-level strategic document that takes the Lisbon strategic concept and tweaks it to reflect the reality of the current security environment, with challenges from the east and the south that we had no idea were coming at the time of Lisbon, and which impact particularly on the TMD mission. As Frank emphasized, the wide area Aegis defense system is oriented to the southeast and not towards Russia. But TMD, of course, is part of our deterrent strategy, 360. So in this political guidance, we needed to come to some key decisions about how TMD fit into the overall deterrence and defense picture of NATO, and we succeeded in getting that done. Beyond that, in Roberto's committee, real hard work led by December to agreement on political principles and guidance for what in effect is future operations and defense design work, including the very tricky issue of prioritization, what assets you defend within which countries and between which countries if you have a simultaneous attack. We didn't have that at the time of Chicago. We have that now. Then within the Air and Missile Defense Committee, we recently, in the last couple of weeks, reached agreement on the overarching integrated air and missile defense policy, putting that through military committee and NAC approval. In 2014, we had agreed on the legal guidance, and last year within the CNAD, we had agreed on consequences of intercept and consequences of engagement guidance in terms of technical and operational considerations. Still some more work to do in that area, but we do have a key building block at 28 consensus that we did not have at the time of Chicago. And then last and not least, increased functionality. And I want to stress again, this is not that all the various programs that you and the contractor community, the defense industry community, in many cases are directly engaged with, because those are still working through key contract milestones all the way through to FOC in 2023. But the question here was, have we increased the functionality by a sufficient margin from what we had at the time of Chicago to warrant this IOC declaration today. There are different components of that. A part of it, of course, is that NATO itself can do a defense design and not have to have that outsourced. We've developed the new defense design for IOC using the NATO tool, RC2IS. Now, to be sure, you still send the result of that back to individual nations and ask them to use national systems to confirm and validate that the defense design is accurate, which we've done. But the NATO tool itself created the defense design, and this is an improvement since Chicago. We very recently had a certification from the general manager of NCIA that the various national communications gateways had been installed and that the full interoperability had been demonstrated in Ensemble Test 4. So we have a certification from the general manager of the NATO agency of technical readiness of the architecture. Beyond that, with the RC2 Baseline 3 maintenance release work that's been done intensively the last several months, we've corrected some of the stability issues that popped up after RC2IS had been validated in terms of the contractor delivery, in terms of meeting the contract spec, but new problems emerged when it was in an operational environment. We've now gone back and fixed that, and that's been certified by the NATO Steering Committee. And last but not least, with the ACTS TMD 1.1 increment, we now have in the BIMDOC at Ramstein ACTS installed, providing better situational awareness, allowing for combining tracks or a hold fire order, with more to come. 1.2 increment is going to be delivered later this year, and we just passed critical design review on the 1.3 increment, which will be the final iteration of that. So you put all that together, and we, the United States government, are very confident that we're on track for IOC at Warsaw. But we don't have the determining voice. Let's be clear. There's a key step coming in Steadfast Alliance 16, which is a major exercise to test the whole system that begins 18 April and will end on the 29th of April. And that is the required operational certification from SACEUR. General Breedlove, who will be retiring next month, and to whom the NAC will be bidding farewell tomorrow. Now, General Breedlove's going to call it as he sees it. He's not going to pull any punches in his last weeks as SACEUR, his last weeks as a 4-star United States Air Force officer. He will give it to us straight, and we will see what the conclusion of Steadfast Alliance is. But if it works as we are confident it will, he will certify that the new tools, if you will, the new functionality measured in different domains, planning, tasking, surveillance, situational awareness, and interoperability, that these new tools are commensurate with the new capabilities. In other words, there's harmony between the additional deployed capability and the increased functionality. So if he makes that certification of operational readiness of the architecture for IOC, then we have technical, material, and operational certifications. And at that point, we're there, right? Not quite. One other step, and this is sort of over to Chairman Roberto, who's going to pick up where I leave off. Because all of this then has got to be...
And indeed how much has been achieved since Lisbon. Very impressive indeed. But I think it's now over to the Bishop. Roberto.
Thank you. Thank you, Malcolm. Thanks for inviting me again to this year's event. Thanks to RUSI. I haven't had the pleasure of attending the last 17 years of missile defense conferences, nor was I here last year. But I'm thrilled to be back, and we're only a few months away from Warsaw, and I think this year is good timing. Much has already been said by Frank and Robert. There's little for me to add, but as Bob pointed out, I chair the Paul Mill Committee discussions, the Bishops' Committee on missile defense, so I'll add a few observations from my perspective as someone who serves the community of 28 nations. The goal for Warsaw was already mentioned. It is indeed to declare BMD IOC. You will ask, are we going to reach that goal by the time of Warsaw, or will it take longer? The short answer is we don't know yet, collectively. I'm not taking issue with the US position, which I fully understand, but collectively we are not there yet. We don't know yet. Some work still needs to be completed before we'll know for sure, but the ambition is clear. My colleagues in the panel have pointed out how significant the US contribution to NATO BMD have been since the 2012 Chicago summit, when we announced the interim capability. So I don't need to repeat that. That is pretty clear to everyone how important that contribution was and is. But a decision by 28 NATO heads of state to declare IOC does not only depend on progress achieved by the United States, it also depends on progress in a number of other areas. I don't need to repeat the Wales communique language, it was already mentioned, but the comprehensive report, which is mentioned in the Wales communique, is the last piece of the series of events that has to fall into place in order to have heads of state and government declare IOC. So what I'll do is I will address the comprehensive report and say and mention where further work is required, and that will give you a flavor of what it is that we still have to do to have all the pieces of the puzzle in place. Let me give you the short overview. First of all, and I'm not going to mention these in terms of priority, the report, the comprehensive report, will consider the state of play with regard to the evolution of the threat. The Wales communique repeated that the threat to populations, territory, and forces posed by the proliferation of ballistic missiles continues to increase, and that missile defense forms part of a broader response to counter it. Wales also repeated that should international efforts reduce the threats posed by ballistic missile proliferation, NATO missile defense can and will adapt accordingly. These quotes from the summit show that NATO is not developing a BMD capability in the abstract, but on the basis of threat assessments and forecasts. Some of you might ask whether the recent Vienna agreement with Iran had any impact on our BMD plans. The short answer is not the case. 3 reasons in short. First, NATO welcomed the JCPOA, the Iran agreement, the Vienna agreement, which addresses Iran's nuclear program and which will take 8 years, roughly 8 years to implement. Allies certainly hope that the agreement will pull through and that the relationship with Iran will improve further over the next decade. But allies are also aware that the Vienna agreement did not address Iran's ballistic missile program, which remains a concern. Second, NATO BMD is not aimed at any single country. It looks at possible threats from more than one country and from the broader region outside the Euro-Atlantic area. Third, NATO BMD is a long-term program. We cannot afford, nor would it make sense, to stand up or halt a capability development program depending on the mood of the day in just one single country. That's a luxury we don't have. Another area that the comprehensive report will assess is progress achieved with regard to command and control. It was already mentioned. The C2 arrangements that were developed for the interim capability prior to Chicago, and they were reviewed and updated prior to Wales in 2014. These arrangements are being adapted further now to reflect the arrival of the added capabilities. As those among you with military background know, command and control arrangements are important because they include considerations about the chain of command, rules of engagement, readiness levels of available assets, and defense designs. These arrangements are not only important for the military chain of command, for the military authorities, so they know what to do and when. They are also important for the political authorities, since they provide a guarantee that there is political control by allies over military action. That's a point that Bob has also made. This needs to be ensured at all times, and this work is not yet completed, but as Bob explained in elaborate detail, it is now quite advanced. We will also take stock in a comprehensive report of other voluntary national contributions, in addition to those provided by the United States. Until now, we have not said too much on this in public. However, it is a fact that since Chicago, other allies are contributing to NATO BMD. For example, through hosting arrangements, lower layer air and missile defense systems, air and missile defense protection assets, naval or land-based radar upgrades or acquisitions. All of this could be made available to the alliance. My opinion is, and I have shared this in my committee with allies, the more we say in public about non-US voluntary national contributions, the better we will be able to demonstrate that this is a truly multinational effort. Perhaps once we reach BMD IOC, we may be able to say more. I hope we are able. The comprehensive report will also assess progress achieved in the programmatic area. As most in the room know, BMC3I represents the backbone of NATO BMD. It includes both the functionalities required as well as the interfaces with the sensors and weapons systems which are offered voluntarily by allies. This is actually the only portion of NATO BMD which is commonly funded by 28. It is fair to say that the program is progressing, although not without some challenges, which are mostly due to the complexity of the program and the need to accommodate BMD in the broader integrated air and missile defense architecture. In any case, it's also fair to say that allies acknowledge that NATO's commonly funded program will not be completed by the time of Warsaw, and that more will need to be achieved in the years ahead. So we will not be able to have everything in place by the time of Warsaw. Another important point is that we need to be reassured by our military authorities that they have everything that is needed to perform the mission with the assets available to them. And I don't need to go into the details of the certification process, as Bob has already elaborated on that. Last but not least, let me also mention the wider strategic environment, and in particular Russia. I don't know to what extent this will be addressed in a comprehensive report, but allies acknowledge that the hopes for missile defense cooperation that we had in 2010 have not materialized. Allies also acknowledge that BMD has again become a main irritant for Russia and for our relations with Russia. That said, the aim of NATO BMD and NATO's planned BMD course of action have not changed. NATO BMD was not, is not, and will not be against Russia. The NATO summit in Wales took place, and that's, I think, important to note. It took place after the Russian illegal annexation of Crimea, but despite that, in Wales, the alliance did not change this basic principle. I personally do not believe that the Warsaw Summit will change the basic approach. The reasons for sticking to the plan, in other words, for not aiming BMD against Russia, are simple. And we have said this. Capabilities are too limited, planned interceptor numbers too few, and Aegis' shore sites in Romania and Poland are either too far south or too close to Russia to undermine its strategic deterrent, which has been a key concern that Russia always has expressed. Russia has also too many and technologically too sophisticated ballistic missiles for NATO to rely on BMD as an efficient and cost-effective response. Should the new Cold War scenario that was mentioned in February by Russian Prime Minister Medvedev in Munich really materialize in the years to come, then NATO would have to rely on other capabilities and on a full range of such capabilities for deterrence and defense purposes, but not on missile defense. From a NATO perspective, we consider Russian statements threatening to target allies because of their support for NATO BMD unacceptable, unjustified, and counterproductive. If we ever got back to discussing these issues with Russia, allies would certainly make this point. To be honest, many of Russians, and I've written about this, many of Russia's concerns are wider than just the NATO BMD project, and they are not for NATO to address. Europeans are not ignoring the importance of strategic stability, but there is very little margin for maneuver for NATO if Washington and Moscow cannot settle on the broader picture. Russia needs to discuss strategic stability issues first and foremost with the United States bilaterally. Let me conclude. I gave you an overview of some of the issues that allies will consider in one form or another as we prepare the comprehensive report for the Warsaw Summit. The summit might be the moment when we will reach the next level of ambition and declare BMD IOC. However, the goal is condition-based and there is still work to do. Thank you.
Roberto, thank you. Thank you so much for that. Again, compliments our other two speakers very well, and I think raises some really interesting questions towards the end, which I'm sure some of our questioners will want to come back to in relation to NATO's approach to Russia on missile defense and whether that will continue to be as it has been so far.